Knight and Changeling, Chapter 31, Final Betrayal. Gwen makes this look so much easier than it is. Jen grunted, the mana shield at the tips of her fingers, the only thing between her and George and the building currently resting atop them. Can you move it? George asked, trying not to shift and move his sword, which was already dangerously close to Jen at these close quarters. Green lights flashed and Jen transformed into stardust. Give me a minute. Time is of the essence, Jen. I know, this is a lot harder when I can't concentrate. George stopped talking. Jen focused and shouted a word. Erratico! The building atop them went flying, the debris exploding outward. Quite the entrance. Jen grinned, floating out of the hole, extending a hand to George. I am good at those. He smiled back as they turned to Vilgax. He was battering the seal again, and Jen summoned a ball of mana and threw it hard. It slammed into him, and he went spinning to the ground. But the seal still hadn't broken. Tennyson! Vilgax howled in rage. I will not be denied! I serve my master's will. He will be freed. You serve no will but your own. You always have. Vilgax howled in rage, throwing another ball of energy at Jen, sending her tumbling through the air. Liar! I serve my master! But Jen was good at telling when someone was holding back. Vilgax was using no more power against them than he had the last time they had fought. If he'd truly been gifted by the Dagon, he could have been fighting them harder from the start. But that fact didn't matter long. Not when Gwen showed up back under the control of the Dagon. She shifted into her full anodite form and Jen stepped between her and the seal. Don't make me fight you, Gwen. I don't want to hurt you. Kevin and George hung back slightly. Vilgax was simply watching as Gwen walked up to Stardust. You are a small one. Powerful, yes, with endless potential. But you lack the skill this one has. Gwen's voice wasn't her own as she lifted a hand and blasted at Jen. She dodged the first blast, and the cavern shook as mana met mana in a clash that had the ground cracking and smoke rising from the air. Kevin dove to the side as a large boulder came crashing to the ground. Jen went flying, buried in the wall of the cavern with a groan. All raw power, no finesse. Gwen stepped up to the seal and began battering at it. George raced to the stardust-shaped hole in the wall. Kevin raced up to Gwen and yanked her around, away from the seal. Gwen, come back to me. You cannot stop me. He shook his head. You're wrong, I hope. He allowed the metal covering him to seep out over Gwen's purple skin until it covered her entirely. Once that was done, with a scream from her that left his teeth on edge, he pulled the metal back to him, leaving a helmet behind, covering her head. She stumbled back to her human form and blinked at him, her eyes back to their clear forest green again. Kevin? He pulled her into his arms. You're okay. Okay is kind of relative right now, Kevin, Jen said as George pulled her from the debris. She was human again, and her nose was bleeding. Jen leveled a hand at Vilgax, Tadenite growing from the ground around him. Master, I need more power. But this time, silence persisted. Jen glared. Looks like you're on your own now, Vilgax. It was then that a ship came in through one of the now numerous holes in the cavern ceiling. Jen was sort of hoping it was a plumber ship. Maybe someone had been off planet when all this went down, but no, she was never that lucky. Instead, Siphon scurried out of the ship. Vilgax glared. You took your time. I am sorry, my lord. It took time to gather everything you needed. Siphon made to rush back into the ship. Not yet, you idiot. Jen rolled her eyes. You really couldn't find anyone better than Siphon to help you? You have sunk down pretty far, Vilgax. Vilgax turned to her, but a voice echoed out from the seal. You are all too late. The deed is done. The seal is broken. The voice echoed around as yellow light sheared through the cave. The seal crumbled away, but there was nothing left behind.
"Where is it?"
Kevin asked. Jen shook her head, racing with George to the spot where the ship had entered the cave. Kevin and Gwen caught up to them quickly. Looking up, they saw a sight that had their very blood freezing in their veins.
"I am everywhere."
The beast was so large, it filled the whole sky. It did sort of look like Vilgax's more aquatic form, but it wore armor on its face and radiated power like nothing any of them had ever seen. Chapter 32. Retreat. George wasted no time challenging the Dagon. Jen turned to Kevin and Gwen. "Behind you!" Gwen whirled, slamming a wall of mana into the esoterica who had tried to take them by surprise. Jen smiled slightly. "I have an idea. Just don't die, okay?" They nodded, smiling at each other as they turned to continue the battle. Seeing Ultimate way big was something completely new, and for a moment they had hope that the battle wasn't lost. But then she vanished in a cloud of acidic rain, and the Dagon laughed. George roared in rage, sending a blast of power from his sword. The esoterica went flying. He charged the Dagon as more of the Dagon's minions came rushing into the valley. They were tossed aside, though, before they could reach the two teens. Jen reformed from Ultimate Wild Mutt in a flash of green. Kevin leveled his rifle and blasted an esoterica directly behind her. She grinned. Gwen frowned, throwing up a shield to buy them a few seconds reprieve from the fight. "You all right?" Gwen could see she wasn't entirely okay. There were holes in her jacket, and the skin visible underneath was red and irritated, probably from the acidic rain. "I'll be fine," Jen said, glancing over at where George was facing the Dagon.
"What's the plan?"
"Help George. That sword's our best bet for beating the Dagon now. I am a bit worried about where Vilgax wandered off to." Gwen blasted the shield outward, knocking down the next wave of esoterica. "Can we worry about Vilgax after we deal with the literal demon raining down fire?" she asked, whipping a line of mana around the next wave of fighters and throwing them into the ones behind them. Jen nodded, glancing at George. "Just keep an eye out for him. If he managed to summon Siphon while he was in the Dagon's dimension, then he's planning something desperate." Kevin nodded as Jen transformed into Chromastone.
"She's not wrong. He's not one to just give up."
Gwen nodded as Jen raced off to George, leaping into the path of one of the Dagon's energy beams, absorbing it and blasting it back at him. "George, now!" The combined blasts had the Dagon crying out, though if it was in rage or pain, there was no way of telling. But one of the drawbacks of Chromastone was that while channeling energy, she couldn't move. That got her smacked out of the sky by one of the Dagon's tentacles. She went crashing into the earth as George roared out a challenge again. "You will do her no more harm, foul creature." The Dagon laughed, then screamed as George slashed, energy following Ascalon's blade, marring the creature's eye. The Dagon roared in pain as black blood rained.
"Enough of this."
The Dagon rose into the air above George as Kevin and Gwen rushed to the unmoving form of Chromastone in the crater her crash had created. "The clouds will not defend you, Dagon. I will end you for all the harm you have done to me and mine."
"You should not fear the clouds, George the Triumphant. Fear the lightning."
Kevin and Gwen pulled Jen to her feet as she transformed back to herself. She shook her head, trying to come back to herself. Red lightning flashed across the battlefield, temporarily blinding them all. When the lights cleared, Jen was the first to react. She cried out in rage and desperation. Phasing through Gwen and Kevin's hands, she rushed to Sir George, who had fallen to his knees. Old once more. Ascalon was buried in the ground in front of him, but Jen paid it no mind as she rushed to her friend. He was shaking, going gray.
"I have failed. You must undertake my task. Raise the sword. Defeat the Dagon."
His voice was weak as he began to flake away into dust. He looked up at the sky beyond where the Dagon was, to the stars still twinkling there.
I never wanted it to end this way. I am sorry.
She reached out to him, but he closed his eyes and was gone, blown away by the wind. Jen whirled on the Dagon, fire blazing in her eyes as tears raced down her face. The Dagon laughed. Jen growled and took hold of the hilt of Ascalon. A flash of green blared around the battlefield. The Dagon cried out in rage and blasted at the place Jen had been, but his blast was reflected back as the light died down. Where Jen had been standing was now a woman in armor, very much like what George had been wearing. There were a few differences, though. This armored figure had a cloak swirled around her shoulders with the symbol of the Omnitrix emblazoned on the back, clipped closed with the same symbol. But before she could do anything, Vilgax reappeared on the field. Gwen blinked, and Jen, resplendent in her shining armor, was in front of them. Vilgax's plan became clear when he stepped smartly out of the way of the Dagon's blast, only for it to be caught in the machine that Siphon had brought with him. It was the same machine he had used to drain the power from 10 heroes of 10 worlds. Because the Dagon's very being was made of power, it was quickly absorbed into the machine. Vilgax laughed, standing in front of the machine.
You know what to do, Siphon.
No! But they were too late. Siphon was already transferring the power to Vilgax. He cackled as the red light that had been the Dagon enveloped him. Jen swung the sword and the machine exploded, sending Siphon flying, but the deed was done.
The Esoterica worshipped me as the Dagon. Now I am the Dagon.
Vilgax crowed triumphantly from his new place in the sky. He had taken on the giant form of the Dagon. Gwen grabbed Kevin's hand and Jen's shoulder and shouted a spell as Vilgax used the Dagon's power to fire on them. He cackled in triumph as the dust cleared, revealing an empty crater where the 3 humans had been.